Thank you, everyone. So, as it was said, my name is Stephanie Denning, and I'm a final year PhD student at the University of Bristol. So, today I'm going to be talking to you about combining research with voluntary sector leadership, and that's in the specific context and scale of myself running a Make Lunch kitchen responding to children's holiday hunger. So, in doing this, I combined action research and participatory geographies, framing myself as a researcher, a volunteer, and the project leader. And I'm going to be arguing that researchers and voluntary sector leaders can challenge and be challenged by positionality and power relations, and it's important not to see these only as limiting factors. So this paper is framed within food poverty and holiday hunger. So food poverty is really important. It's not just about a lack of food. It's also about the affordability of food, the accessibility of food, so whether someone can get to food at a reasonable price, and it's the nutritional value of food. It's not just how much you're eating, but what you're actually eating. Now, this research focuses on holiday hunger. Holiday hunger is a particular dimension of food poverty when children don't have enough to eat in the school holidays. There's 170 non-school days in the UK calendar year compared to 190 school days, which is actually almost an equal balance. So for 1 million children in the UK, that's almost half the year when they're not receiving a free school meal. But there's actually an estimated 3 million children at risk of holiday hunger in the UK, 1 million who have free school meals, but a further 2 million who aren't eligible for free school meals but are experiencing poverty both in term time and in the school holidays. So just briefly, what are the impacts of holiday hunger? Well, obviously there's going to be a health impact if a child isn't eating, but there's also impacts for the parents, and studies have found parents skipping meals or drinking water with lemons just to save the food for their children. A Kellogg study in 2015 found that 1/3 of parents in Great Britain have skipped a meal in the holidays to feed their children. There's also an impact upon the educational attainment of the children. Studies have found that children that didn't eat enough over the school holidays, particularly the 6-week summer school holidays, their educational attainment is behind their peers when they return to school in September, compared to those peers that did eat healthily and enough food over the holidays. It can also impact children in how many new foods they're trying. If parents don't have the budget to have a sort of an alternative meal that evening, you're going to buy a food that you know that your child is going to accept, and it's those higher calorific, carbohydrate-rich foods which children find more accepting compared to, say, vegetables. Some of them you need to eat 10 times before your palate finds that an acceptable taste. Finally, another impact is a lack of money for other activities in the school holidays, particularly, as I said, in the 6 weeks. So in this research, I worked with a national charity, Make Lunch. Make Lunch is a Christian charity with over 75 lunch kitchens across the UK, and it runs as a social franchise. So lunch kitchens are run by churches, mainly in church halls, community halls, and in schools. And Make Lunch is also looking to develop with schools themselves running the projects, being the franchise partners. Make Lunch kitchens provide the equivalent of a free school meal in the school holidays, and it's important that it's a time of play as well as the food, so it's more like a holiday club than, say, a soup kitchen where you come and go. Since it was established in 2011, Make Lunch kitchens across the country have served 65,000 meals, and it's really important that Make Lunch has also been involved in campaigning against holiday hunger. It's not just about the provision, there's the campaigning role as well. For example, contributing evidence to the all-party parliamentary group inquiry into hunger. So as I said, in this research I ran one Make Lunch kitchen, and in January 2015 I started establishing the kitchen, and then we opened and ran between July 2015 and September 2016. So it was about a year ago that I handed over the project to others. Where did the project run? Well, it was in an anonymous inner city area where deprivation is in the top 5% of deprivation nationally. It ran through a Church of England church in a church hall that was attached to the main church building. We served 774 meals in just over a year to 103 local primary school aged children. So some children came regularly and others came more on a kind of one-off occasion. And as with most lunch kitchens, there were games as well as the food. So children were with us for almost 2 hours. It was also important that although the project had a faith ethos and ran in a church, there was no religious content for the children. It was about food, it was about play. The project relied upon volunteers to run, so over the period that I ran the project, I recruited 78 volunteers, and we had around 10 volunteers at each session. Volunteers came from across the city that the project ran in, so they came from quite a variety of different backgrounds, both in terms of their experiences and kind of their economic background, and they were aged from teenagers up to people in their 80s. And again, with the project having a faith ethos, many of the volunteers were Christian, but this wasn't a specific requirement, so not all of the volunteers were Christians. My PhD has looked at how faith can motivate people to volunteer and how this persists over time. But in the context of voluntary sector leadership, leading the kitchen, myself as a researcher and the leader, I found that this led me to reflect on how I was both challenged and I could challenge positionality and power. And I think this can be applied more generally for voluntary sector leadership and combining that with research. So the research is framed within three main methodologies: action research, participatory geographies, and ethnography. And the research has elements of all of these without falling exclusively into any of them for various reasons. These methodologies provide a different emphasis on knowledge production. Action research in particular is about co-production of knowledge with the participants, rather than the researcher being the one that has the exclusive kind of all-knowing position. They aspire for positive social change, so it was really important to me to make lunch and to the church that the project ran in, that the project was going to be sustainable. It wasn't just for my research purposes. So as I said, I've since handed over the project, and it's continued to run successfully within the church and also contributed in the national media to public understanding and campaigning against holiday hunger. I'll come on to this more in a minute, but positionality and power are important in each of these methodologies, and I had quite a complex positionality in this process as a researcher, as the project coordinator, coming from outside the local area, but then being Christian alongside most of the volunteers was a point of commonality. So how were the volunteers involved in the research? Well, 28 of the 78 volunteers wrote solicited diaries over the time that they volunteered, and this gave 110 entries. So the shortest was from a one-day experience volunteering, and the longest entries were over the whole 15 months, which has given a really rich set of data. 18 volunteers took part in semi-structured interviews, and that led to about half of the number of volunteers in total took part directly in the research. And I also kept a field diary, so I myself was a sort of research participant for myself. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is positionality, and then moving on to power. So traditionally across the social sciences, positionality has been framed as a limiting factor that limits the researcher's ability to undertake ethnography or to participate. However, through action research's epistemology, I frame positionality as a dimension which the researcher can enact upon, ideally for positive change. So the role of the researcher is key in participatory research, as is their having a willingness to learn, rather than perceiving themselves as the expert extracting knowledge from participants or from volunteers. The key theme in this research in terms of positionality was that of privilege. I was coming from a position of relative privilege, having never experienced food poverty. However, this did give the opportunity in the research process to aim for positive social change. But within this, research preparation was really crucial. So at this point, when I was starting the research, I'd already been volunteering for a couple of years at a local Trust food bank. And once we established that I was going to be running the project at this church, I started volunteering at the church's youth group. And I felt that was important to show some kind of commitment to the community, to get to know people, get to know how things worked in the area. So framing privilege in this way, through positionality, gives a positive response to what Mary Bryden Miller calls the terrifying truth of whether to act or not. And this terrifying truth is that a fear of one's own privilege can reduce a person to inaction because of the fear of how you're going to come across. However, I'd argue that inaction would have been a poorer option than acting and acknowledging that power and positionality exist. Ultimately, without my action in establishing the kitchen, it wouldn't have occurred in this area and in this church at this particular time. It's really important, though, that my positionality changed over time and wasn't static throughout the research process. So I was an outsider initially at the host church, but the fact that I was a Christian gave some point of commonality, and I did become more accepted as part of the community over time. And privilege also played out in volunteers' conversations. So here I'm going to introduce Violet, who was a volunteer the whole time that I ran the project. She's a middle-aged lady who came from a relatively privileged area outside of the kitchen. And she was really challenged. She was motivated by her faith and politics to volunteer. But privilege played out in the conversations that she had with volunteers. So she wrote in her diary, "Whilst making the dough, an older local bloke came into the kitchen and asked what we were doing. I explained about the kitchen feeding kids who normally get a free school meal and the difficulty holidays pose for their parents. To my complete shock, he was utterly disparaging of the parents. They shouldn't be so feckless. Why have children if they can't feed them? Why don't they get rid of their satellite TV, etc.? But we can't judge their situation. We don't know what's happened in their lives," I replied, feeling on the one hand that I really believe in the project and why we're doing it, but at the same time slightly uncomfortable about arguing with one of the locals, who no doubt had his own story. "Oh, I know, I'm an old bigot," he said, "but my mother had 4 of us, and she managed after my dad died." "That must have been very difficult," I said. "Yes," he replied, "it was, but she kept us fed and clothed without any help." Then he went out with his tray of stuff, leaving me to think about what it is that makes us react to circumstances in the way we do, and my own family's history. So Violet was really aware in the conversations that she'd be having that she wasn't from the local area, and wanted to come across in a way that was considering of different people's positions. But when she was challenged by someone from the local area about whether the project should even take place, she was then able to reflect on her positionality, reflect on their different experiences, and reply in what she felt was a sensitive way. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is power. Power is a complex phenomenon that can seem inescapable for the researcher and the research process. And there's a link here between positionality and power, because clearly what kind of position you're in is going to influence the power that you have or don't have. But just like positionality, power is also not static, and as researchers we can be both powerful and powerless at different times and in different spaces. So power can be both elusive and layered. So looking first in my power as a researcher and the project leader. But it was important that the project was funded independently of the research, and when I handed the project over, there was funding in place for the project to run for several years. So it was important that I didn't hold kind of all of the purse strings. It was important in terms of power dynamics with the volunteers, that volunteers didn't have to participate in the research, and volunteers were reminded throughout volunteering that the research was also taking place, so it wasn't a covert process. What's perhaps more interesting, more complex, is the complex power dynamics amongst the volunteer team. So as I said, volunteers came from a variety of backgrounds, and many didn't know each other in advance, but then some did and came from the same churches. So the volunteer team changed each day, and this presented a really complex set of power dynamics, as people needed to establish relationships quickly in order to function on that particular day at the lunch kitchen. But at the same time, trust and mutual respect were needed, and people needed to establish these relationships. But it took time for genuine relationships to be established, and this is something that can be seen through Violet, who we've just reflected on, and Nora. So Nora is also a middle-aged lady, like Violet, volunteering on the cooking side of the project. But the difference to Violet is that Nora came from within the lunch kitchen host church and lived in the local area. So she wrote in summer 2015, when we first started. So in her diary, she wrote, "My first session at the lunch kitchen tomorrow. I've not met the kitchen leader and am quite worried as to what she'll be like. Will she be bossy or snobby and look down her nose at us?" But by Easter of the following year, Nora wrote, "Before lunch kitchen today was the most relaxed I've been. I knew the routine and most of the people, so no longer felt nervous. It was just like going out to work or to meet friends." Now we can compare and contrast this with Violet's experience, and she also wrote a diary. She volunteered at the same time and also wrote a diary in summer 2015 and Easter 2016. So in the summer, she said, "This time, the other two in the kitchen came from the lunch kitchen host church, a mother and daughter, the mother being Nora, rather than imports from middle-class churches. I wonder how they feel about me coming into their church's kitchen as kitchen leader for the day. Does it feel like an invasion? Do I just seem like some middle-class do-gooder?" By Easter, the roast dinner was as popular as ever, and it was good to see Nora again, this time with another of her daughters. So what really comes across here is the power dynamic between Nora and Violet, which changed over time as they became friends. But receiving these diaries also presented a challenge for myself as a researcher. They didn't know that they had each written about each other, although we were open as to who was keeping diaries and they knew that they were both keeping diaries. But this presented a challenge. Should I discuss these diaries with them directly? Should I discuss it with each other? And that was a real challenge, as no one took the option for the diaries to be given anonymously. So I knew who'd written the diaries. And I think the resolution really was, particularly for Nora, the first time she volunteered, well, for the first few months, she was writing a lot about her anxiety at starting to volunteer, about not knowing who was going to be there. And so without discussing the diary content specifically with her, I was able to tell her who she was going to be volunteering with, make sure she had all of that information in advance. So participatory methods have been critiqued for reinstating power relations rather than challenging them. So I could ask myself, was I too guilty of this critique, both in terms of my relationship with volunteers and relationships between volunteers? Well, Kesby et al. In 2009 say this is all about how we understand power. And they say it's important that power and domination aren't synonymous. So we need to be aware of power dynamics, but they're not necessarily going to be a domination. Therefore, if positionality and power are actively engaged with and recognised as transient, rather than being a terrifying truth, they can present opportunities as well as challenges in the research process that combines research and voluntary sector leadership. So to conclude, what I've presented here has been a small-scale example to give an insight into voluntary sector leadership through combining running a faith-based project relying upon volunteers. And we find in this process that power and positionality can present challenges for voluntary sector leaders and for researchers. But it's really important that power and positionality are always changing, and this changing dimension of them presents an opportunity for leaders and researchers to challenge power and positionality and to endeavour to enact positive social change. So I'd argue that in voluntary sector leadership, we shouldn't see power and positionality as limiting factors, but actually actively engage with them as opportunities.